This is Digaris Masculist MGTOW Flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Digaris. This is flyer number 480, entitled Masculist Criminalizing and Sentencing of the Major Gender Crimes Committed by Women Against Men, Masculist Jurisprudence. Description. This flyer makes an appeal to men who are both masculists and jurists to dream up masculist laws, a masculist jurisprudence, so that women who commit major gender crimes against men, that manslave men for decades of their lives, are prosecuted and punished by the law. Now the flyer itself. Masculist criminalizing and sentencing of the major gender crimes committed by women against men, masculist jurisprudence, by Prof. Dr. Hugo Digaris. Email profhugodigaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodigaris.wordpress.com. I've been thinking more lately about the second major stage in masculism, that is, the political stage, after the initial consciousness raising stage. That is, becoming aware that there is a problem with the traditional male role of being a manslave to a woman for decades of a man's life, and wondering what forms this second stage could take. Masculists have an obvious precedent in the form of the history of the rise of modern-day feminism, which too went through an initial consciousness-raising phase in the 60s and early 70s, then quickly moved into the second phase, the political phase, by pushing for such things as the right for equal pay for equal work, the right for women to enter the professions, the abortion right, fault-free divorce, control of the divorce courts, setting up domestic violence shelters, pushing for the ERA, that's Equal Rights Amendment, which they nearly got, etc. Lots of feminist lawyers then got active, applying their feminist mentalities to the law, especially in the divorce courts, which were of particular interest to women, since half of marriages fail, and a half of those failures end up in the divorce courts. So feminist jurists flooded into them, wreaking such havoc in them that the injustice committed against men in these fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts was pretty much the driving principle behind the rise of the MGTOW movement. These fluffy feminist lawyers made divorce so toxic for men that they made marriage and paternity toxic for men, so that today, in many countries, 2/3 of young men refuse to marry and reject paternity, thus crashing the birth rate and wiping out whole populations, thus making these fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts indirect genociders, since it is these fluffy feminists who are the root cause of the rise of the MGTOW movement. So I'm thinking about the corresponding male version of these feminist legal types and what masculist legal types could do. That is, I'm thinking about a masculist jurisprudence. In brackets, jurisprudence is legal theory. That is, the philosophy and analysis of legal systems, looking at what the law is for and how it should be implemented, etc. I'm not a legal type. In brackets, my two main intellectual interests at the moment are math and masculism, close bracket. So the speculations below are from a legal novice, an amateur. I've never come across anything that could be described as broad-stroke masculist jurisprudence, so the ideas below are tentative and new. Of course, there have been masculist jurisprudence for decades in the divorce courts. Male lawyers, and in brackets, and even some female lawyers who are trying to get gender justice for men in the divorce courts. For example, the British masculist lawyers who fought against the idea of alimony in the UK divorce courts, claiming that it was a parasite's charter. What I'm thinking of is much broader, a new kind of masculist jurisprudence that is based on broad masculist ideas, such as the major masculist push on women to get off their fat parasitic asses and FIP up, brackets, that is, become FIPs, equals financially independent persons, by bothering to get a career competent education and not expect fluffy style, in brackets, fluffy equals traditional woman who expects to parasite off the labour and money of a man for decades of his life, thus manslaving him for decades, a major gender crime by her against him that needs to be criminalised and sentenced, close brackets. To manslave a man and thus commit a major gender crime against him. This new kind of masculist jurisprudence would be based on a broad masculist consciousness, that is, that women have a life expectancy of 85 years and a career window of half a century, so have a powerful moral duty to FIP up, to pull their financial weight, or be severely punished by men for being fluffy, manslaving, parasitic vermin. Masculist jurisprudence would be the legal side of this masculist push, this gender political paradigm shift that is essentially a rebellion by men, by masculists, against being manslaves to women. Masculists punish women who are fluffies and fluffy feminists severely by effectively exterminating them slowly, by totally avoiding them, not even pumping and dumping them. So these hated fluffy manslaving parasites and fluffy feminist hypocrite genociders have their fluffy genes removed from the gene pool by being forced to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and spat at. This flyer is about the legal side of that contempt by masculists against fluffies and fluffy feminists. It begins by listing the major gender crimes that women commit against men, and then starts thinking about how these crimes could be criminalised and sentenced. The biggest gender crime that women commit against men is their decades-lasting manslaving parasitism against men by not fipping up, not bothering to get career-competent educations so that they can be financially responsible FIPs as adults, and not be fluffies who parasite off the money and labour of a man, manslaving him for decades, a major gender crime by her, a war issue, in fact. Since to masculists, fluffydom is manslavery, and manslavery is slavery, and masculists have a hatred of manslavery, and in the limit will go to war to stop it. Masculists see manslavery as a much bigger problem than Negro slavery in the US in the 1800s, since there are billions of man slaves in the world today. So how could a masculist jurist apply jurisprudence to the fluffy parasite problem? What other major gender crimes do women commit against men? Paternity fraud is a big one, forcing a man to pay for decades of his life for a kid that is not even his. That is, the mother lies to her husband/boyfriend that the child growing in her is his, but it's not. The father is some other man. Paternity fraud is an obvious criminal offence, but women are not routinely prosecuted for this crime, which has to change. Masculist jurisprudence aims to change all that. Women's pill lying is another major gender crime committed by women against men. When a woman lies to her husband/boyfriend that she's taking the pill, isn't, gets pregnant, then forces him, by law, to pay for a kid that he doesn't want, thus manslaving him for decades, another massive gender injustice against men that needs masculist jurisprudence to combat. I hope the above gives you a taste of the type of problem I'm talking about. That is, how to apply legal, jurisprudential thinking to these massive gender crimes committed by women against men. How to criminalise them and how to sentence them. Just how severe should the sentences handed down by judges be against offending women? This kind of thinking, as far as I know, is virgin territory, so I'm stumbling in the dark. Maybe some young PhD student in law might attempt to do his PhD on the topic, masculist jurisprudence, or some young ambitious assistant professor who is out to flex his intellectual muscles and carve out a niche for himself by pioneering this new branch of law, of jurisprudence, that is, masculist jurisprudence, might be attracted to the challenge. I'll begin making some suggestions from the ground up, starting with the easiest cases that seem so obviously criminal, and then working up, tackling more conceptually difficult cases. Remember, I'm no lawyer, just an amateur, thinking about how masculist ideas could be applied in the law courts, forcing women to stop behaving in massively gender criminal ways. I'll start with paternity fraud, and with an obviously cut and dried case. Imagine some woman lies explicitly to her boyfriend/husband that the baby growing in her is his, because she claims that she has only had sex with him around the time of the conception. Let us assume that these two people are whites, but when the baby is born, it is half Negro, half black. Then obviously the woman, the mother, has been lying. She obviously had sex with some black guy and lied to her boyfriend/husband. Let us assume that the boyfriend/husband is a masculist and is extremely angry at what his girlfriend/wife has done, arguing that if he knew that she was pregnant with some other man's kid, then no way would he pay for that kid, putting pressure on her to pay for the kid entirely after the birth or get an abortion. This raises the big issue of the para, that's paternity rejection right, that keeps coming up in my masculist jurisprudential thinking and is a major theme in my masculist thinking as a whole. Let's jump some years into the future when the para has been legislated so that the angry boyfriend/father could tell his ex girlfriend/wife that if he had known that the kid was not his, that he could have exercised his right to the para and hence remove himself from any legal obligation to pay for the kid or push her to get an abortion. The whole jurisprudence of the para is a major theme in this new branch of law, since it crops up in so many masculist contexts. It is a complicated business that will require a lot of thought, since there are so many practical problems with it that will need to be thought through. This is the end of part 1.